afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Thanks always to Maren Goodson, our indefatigable convener of the Middle East Committee here at Westmoreland. Thanks also to a number of people who've worked to put this panel together behind the scenes. And a big thanks to our three panel participants. You'll get to hear more about them and more from them in just a minute. Let me say a few words about Westmoreland Congregational United Church of Christ. Pardon me, located on land that is the land of the Piscataway people. They are no longer here. And so we honor them, but we also recognize that while we are situated geographically through buildings, we are, thanks to the wonder of the internet, dispersed throughout the country and around the world. A little bit about Westmoreland really quickly, because I have the microphone. Albert Einstein said that the ideals which have always shone before him and filled him with joy are goodness, beauty, and truth. And I think and hope that those three ideals are what Westmoreland is about as a congregation, also goodness, beauty, and truth. Goodness to me means acts of charity and justice, like working for affordable housing here in our nation's capital and ending gun violence and saying that Black Lives Matter. Beauty is what I hear in our music and what I see in our flower arrangements and what I feel in our sacred space where everyone is welcome. To me, Westmoreland values truth by exploring deep wisdom and smart theology with open minds. And I think that our Middle East Committee represents those same three values. Goodness by exploring relationships of justice and peace in the Middle East. Truth by seeking wisdom and new ways of understanding, and good by bringing together diverse people and diverse voices for common purposes in the world. So thank you for being a part of this, and I want to dedicate this time to goodness, beauty, and truth. The Middle East Committee begins each of its gatherings with a prayer or a meditation. Our conversation today is about relationships in Palestine and Israel, which means we are dealing mostly with people who come from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. And so in that spirit, I want to offer a prayer today from the Buddhist tradition. In 1986, the United Nations held a day of prayer for world peace in Assisi, Italy. Representatives from the world's larger religious traditions voiced prayers, and there was a prayer offered by Buddhist representatives on that day. I like this prayer because it refers to wilderness, and that's our theme at Westmoreland for this Lenten season. And it also has a word in it about illness, which I think makes us recognize, again, this pandemic time that we are living through. So I invite you to hear these words from the Buddhist tradition as an opening prayer. May all beings everywhere plagued with sufferings of body and mind quickly be freed from their illnesses. May those frightened cease to be afraid, and may those bound be free. May the powerless find power, and may people think of befriending one another. May those who find themselves in fearful, trackless wildernesses, the children, the aged, the unprotected, be guarded by beneficent celestials, and may they swiftly attain liberation, enlightenment, awareness, oneness. And so I would add to that refrain, or to that prayer, the refrain of my childhood as a Baptist: let all God's people say, amen.
Amen.
And so thank you again to our three panelists. It's my privilege to introduce our moderator for today's conversation. Dr. Alton Frye is a faithful and devoted member here at Westmoreland Congregational United Church of Christ, along with his family. He's had a remarkable career working in the United States Senate, an advisor to presidential campaigns, and cultivating relationships of understanding around the world, writing thoughtful pieces that have been published in all kinds of publications. Alton is the former vice president and director of the Washington office of the Council on Foreign Relations, where he continues to serve as presidential Senior Fellow Emeritus. So those are things that make him ideally situated to moderate the topic today. He's also ideally situated to moderate a Zoom conversation because I think he worked his way through college as a radio disc jockey. Is that right, Alton? Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, my memory unfortunately includes some aspects of that.
Some aspects of that. So that gives him not only the gravitas on the issues, but the voice to guide us through this conversation. So Alton, thank you for guiding us today. Thanks to Jonathan and Elena as well. But now I'll turn it over to you, Alton.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank all of you who are participating in this interesting and we think provocative conversation. We're addressing an issue that millions had hoped never to face. For decades, many Palestinians, Israelis, and their well-wishers have pinned hopes on the idea of a two-state solution. The two peoples would have separate states with reliable commitments to provide security for both of them. In 2021, events have conspired to make that option less likely. An extensive survey of Middle East experts just this month found that barely 42% consider the two-state solution still possible. A small majority think its time has passed. An important finding in that survey goes to a factor of great sensitivity. 59% consider the current status to be in effect a one-state solution akin to apartheid. And 77% believe that on the current course, a decade from now, we'll see a one-state solution akin to apartheid. That is the context for our discussion today with author Jonathan Kuttab and Rabbi Alana Suskin. Mr. Kuttab was born in Jerusalem. He earned his law degree in the United States and practiced here before returning to Jerusalem. There, he has been a human rights leader on many fronts, notably as co-founder of Nonviolence International. His new study, Beyond the Two-State Solution, deals directly and creatively with the excruciating challenges that now confront the peace process. Rabbi Suskin has also performed important service in many fields, including as a leader in Americans for Peace Now. Among other efforts in a remarkably versatile career, she is co-founder of the Pomegranate Initiative, which works to oppose anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Mr. Kuttab will offer opening remarks summarizing his analysis of what might be done to move beyond the current deadlock in Israeli-Palestinian relations. Rabbi Suskin will follow with her own assessment. Let me stress that this is not designed to be a debate, but to be an open-minded exploration of the dilemmas facing those who seek a just outcome for both Palestinians and Israelis. Following discussion among the panelists, as mentioned earlier, we will turn to questions from the audience. You may post them in the chat box, or if the technology permits, we'll enable you to ask questions directly. Signal by waving your hand when the moment comes. Please identify yourself at that time and frame your question or comment concisely. Mr. Kuttab, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks to all of those who have joined this discussion. I am assuming from the few people that I know and from the introductions that most of you are generally familiar with the Israeli-Palestinian situation, probably also feeling the kind of paralysis and lack of optimism that most of us feel. And I speak as a person who for many years worked very hard to try and achieve a two-state solution as a compromise between the Zionist movement and the Palestinian national movement. And it was not an easy thing for me to abandon that particular paradigm. But the paralysis in which we find ourselves requires some out-of-the-box thinking. And this is what I attempted to do in this book. But I attempted to do it in a different way than the way many people approach it. I tried to see what is it that Palestinians really, really want? And what is it that Zionist Jews really, really want? I mean, each group is being told by its own ideology that what they want is a state, a national state that belongs to them, a passport, a flag, an airport, etc. But I know that for many Palestinians, what we need is not a state, but the kind of freedom and empowerment and participation that people think comes with a state. If I have my own state, I can travel, I can participate, I can have self-determination. So asking many Zionists, what is it that you want in a Jewish state? I remember one rabbi, Zionist, centrist, maybe slightly left. And I said, what does a Jewish state mean to you? And he said, after thinking about it, he said, I want a state where any Jew, anywhere, anytime, no questions asked, can go and live and be able to defend himself. I said, well, maybe I can give you something better. How about a state where any Jew, anywhere, anytime, no questions asked, can go and live where he doesn't need to defend himself because nobody's out to get him? So is it possible to at least imagine an entity, a hybrid entity, that satisfies the basic needs of both groups without giving them exclusivity, without giving them the right to deny or suppress or oppress or delegitimize or de-enfranchise the other group? And if we can, what will it look like? How can we satisfy them? And so this is what this exercise really is all about. And having written it, I realized that I really need to write another book, which is how to get there, which is a totally separate question, although I do have 2 or 3 pages where I try to address specific things that can be moved in that direction. But it is not an easy exercise. It is a painful one. For Palestinians, I can say it's painful for us because we think Palestine Arabiya, Palestine is Arab. And we are confronting a settler colonial movement that's bringing people from all over the world who are not only living in our place, but displacing us. And when we accepted the two-state compromise, we are willing to give up 78% of our country and limit our nationalism to 22%, demilitarized too. West Bank and Gaza, that was basically the essence of a two-state solution. But then you started putting up all these settlements throughout the occupied territories to the point where it is no longer possible physically to achieve a two-state solution without uprooting 700,000 settlers, which is a huge thing. Even if it could be done, the disruption in their lives and their it's just almost too horrible to contemplate. So it was painful for me to say I can share the land with another group. And I suspect it's also painful for Zionists to say, why should we? I mean, we won, we suffered so much, we needed this place. People have all sorts of countries, Arabs have all sorts of countries. Why can't we have one country? Well, by denying Zionism and denying the Jewish state, you're basically being unfair to us. You're being almost anti-Semitic. You're becoming a second Hitler. We cannot afford to trust anybody else. We cannot afford to leave our fate in anybody else's hand. We have nowhere else to go. This is our land. God gave it to us. Balfour gave it to us. Our power made it happen, especially after the Holocaust. We need it. This is where we are, and you cannot take this away from us. We need a Jewish state, a Jewish-dominated, Jewish-controlled Jewish majority state. We will never trust any situation where we are not in charge and in control. So it's a painful conversation, I understand, for both sides. And when I invite people to join in this mental exercise, I'm really asking Zionists to change their Zionism, where Israel is no longer as Jewish as France is French, because half the people in it are not Jewish. And I'm asking myself and my Palestinian compatriots to change their Palestinian nationalism, and instead of thinking of Palestine Arabiya, Palestine is Arab, to realize that half the people in Palestine today are not Arab, they're Jewish. Can it be both Jewish and Arab, Palestinian? Can it accommodate both? And I think it can. So this is the beauty of the exercise, and this is the challenge of the exercise. Can we do this, and can we do it together? Now, I have to admit that one of the hardest things to do is to break out the existing paradigm. People are so totally caught up in it at a number of levels, and I deal with this in the book. Why is it when most experts realize it's not going to happen, people still talk about the two-state solution? Because they have no other language to speak about. And for many people, the one-state solution, to be democratic, one person, one vote, allows 51%, whoever is the majority, to control this enterprise and to basically negate or oppress or suppress the others. And my thesis is no. It's not just a question of demography and numbers. A genuine democracy can and should accommodate substantial minorities as stakeholders, that this is their state as well, and should accommodate them without negating the democratic principle of majority rule, but constrain it within clear constitutional and structural devices that allow even a minority, whether it's Arabs or Jews, to still be fully invested in this state and to think of it as their own. Just because they are no longer 60% or 40%, whoever has that number in their favor can still feel that it is their state, even if they are now a minority. So this is the idea of the book, in case you haven't read it. I hope you do. It's a short one, it's a quick read. And I'd like to hear the challenges, the objections that you may have to this view. I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kuttab. And it is possible that before the day advances, you may hear a challenge or two. Right now, let me turn to Rabbi Suskin. Your commentary, please.
Sure. So first of all, I just want to say that it's a beautiful vision. I think it's a beautiful vision. I think it's generous. And I think it's one that I personally would be happy to live in. I'm going to try not to take up all my time. I think that we would be better using that time in conversation. But I do want to say a couple things. I was particularly moved by Mr. Kuttab's statement. You know, wouldn't it be better to come be in a place where no one is out to get you, him, us? And I just want to note that, you know, that anti-Semitism long predated the state of Israel, or Israel, the nation state. And, you know, it's not going to disappear simply, even if God willing and speedily in our day, we are able, in fact, to solve this problem. You know, anti-Semitism is not a particularly Muslim problem. In fact, it was a much bigger Christian problem than it was, historically speaking. Jews actually got along fairly well in the Muslim world. And in fact, there were not an insignificant number of Jews who were really interested in Pan-Arabism at the, prior to the state of Israel, particularly Mizrahi Jews who were very comfortable in the Ottoman Empire and under Ottoman rule. That said, I just want to make a brief historical note in that in terms of the framing of the book. I think it should be acknowledged that like any document written by anyone, the framing comes from a particular view of matters. A few books have recently spurred me to spend the first 15 pages madly scribbling copious tiny notes to myself. But at the end of that, at the end of the first 15 pages or so, I realized that a deep dive into sort of picayune matters about which we actually entirely agree on the facts would be silly. So instead, I'm going to do something which is unforgivably rude, which I hope you will nevertheless forgive me for, which is I'm going to actually recommend another book, not instead of, but which I think will give a different perspective on the historical framing to which the rest of the book refers, right? So there's one historical framing and even another. The book is actually, I'm going to say, I don't even like the book. So I'm going to suggest that you download it from the library rather than purchase it. It's Ari Shavit's My Promised Land. And the reason I'm recommending it is purely because I think in addition to getting his facts right, it's easy to digest, but most importantly, it offers the perspective of an Israeli who wants to be a good liberal, but ultimately lands himself back in the morass in which we find ourselves. In particular, I want to say that when you read it, note his problematic recurrence to variations on the statement, it had to be that way, which actually, even if you read his own words within that book carefully, it's clear that it did not, in fact, have to be that way, that his own statements of sort of feeling and pressure are actually undermined by his own statements of fact. And I think that's important because a lot of the resistance to change actually comes from that pressured feeling of there isn't any other way, which I think echoes what Mr. Kuttab actually just said in some ways. But I think that historical framework will help people, many of the people here who are neither Muslim Palestinians nor Jewish Israelis, see what the historical facts and the historical framing look like from the point of view of somebody who is really struggling with them and not quite coming up to scratch. So that would be the first thing I would say. The other caveat that I would mention is that while my colleague gives generous weight, and I want to say how deeply I appreciate it, to the trauma of the Holocaust, it's also worth noting that the Holocaust is merely the most recent trauma. It's deeply embedded in Judaism that Israel is our home, religiously speaking. It's in the Hebrew scriptures. It's throughout our texts of our liturgy. It's very deeply embedded. The saddest day on our calendar, Tisha B'Av, falls in the summer. It's a 25-hour fast day, which is preceded by weeks of mourning practices. And it's in memory of the destruction of both temples and our expulsion by foreign powers from that land. And in that vein, I'm offering also, or I hope to offer, that I could also have a deep understanding of the trauma of the Nakba and the recognition that Palestinians too have long memories, and it would be odd to expect them to forget if we haven't. So that's sort of my two caveats, which are both caveats and caveats to my caveats. And as regarding the remaining content, I want to say I think it's beautiful. And I fear it's unrealizable. I would like to be persuaded otherwise. It's difficult for me to see how enough goodwill could be raised to overcome the fears that are in play that have prevented the implementation of the two-state solution, particularly right now, right? Just not even in the Middle East, but in the world. We're living in a time of generally rising nationalism. And in addition to that, we have the context of rapid climate change and its attendant effects on agriculture and available resources in the world, but also in that region in particular. And it makes me fear that if the easier, or what seemed to be the easier solution, two states, can't be implemented, it's hard to see how the harder one would be implemented, especially with the strong feelings that most Jews have been inculcated with towards a one-state solution. And even there's a general preference among, I think both among Muslim Palestinians and Jewish Israelis for two states. And in particular, I noted on page 39 of the book, I believe, number 3 is the preserving ideologies question, because I think that the preserving ideologies has actually been one of the most important factors in the inability to sit down at a table in conversation, because everybody wants to hash out their ideology. Like everybody's like, you have to recognize my perspective on this, and neither side is really able to do that. And just as an example of how difficult that is, even outside that context, how's that working for us in addressing the folks who think Trump won the last election? Have we convinced any of them? So in perfect honesty, I'm not sure what the way forward is on that, or if there is one. And in that sense, I hope to be convinced by this book, which I think is lovely. Maybe I'll be convinced by the next book. But just in terms of what I've seen so far, I fear that it's an unrealizable vision. And I think I'm going to end with that, because I think I've said my piece, and we can have more conversation about that.
Thank you, Alana. Before we pass on, would you be kind enough to repeat slowly the name of the author for the other book that you wanted to mention?
Sure. Ari Shavit, Shavit. And the book is called My Promised Land. And it is from the perspective of an Israel, and it's not a right-wing perspective. I would say it's a centrist perspective. I don't care for the sort of the attitude around the book, but I think it's a good window to that perspective.
Well, I thank you for referring to it, because in the dialogue of this complexity, we want to encourage Ari Shavit to read Mr. Kuttab's book.
Absolutely.
And we should certainly undertake to read his. Mr. Kuttab, do you want initially to offer any response to the points Rabbi Suskin has just made before we go to general conversation?
Yes, I'd like to agree on both points. Number one, anti-Semitism does continue to exist and does continue to be fought, as is Islamophobia. Yes, it continues to exist and needs to be fought. And on the second point, I would also like to agree that the task is very difficult. It's not easy. Whenever any people finds itself in the throes of control, colonialism, slavery, misogyny, well, you name it, it looks like the powerful have all the power, and the powerless are powerless to do anything about it. Certainly, the only way you can go beyond that, at least intellectually, is number one, by taking a historical perspective. Remember, even in the West, in the US, women didn't have even the vote 100 years ago. It's like 1 century. And African Americans were bought and sold as chattel. They weren't even persons. To imagine not only the end of slavery, but the civil rights movement and African American to become a president of the United States, unimaginable. So you have to take the longer historical view. And since we're speaking in a church, you also have to take the theological perspective. You must, at some deep level, either believe that God or history or fate moves in a certain direction, and you have to go beyond the power of the person with the gun or with the sword or with the bomb, and to believe that at a deeper level, God or the universe will intervene. And I think you have to be full of hope that a better world can and should come about. I mean, if I were a Rohingya in Myanmar today, I can't even imagine what would give me equality, what would give me freedom. It's hard to imagine it while you're in the midst of it. But you can still have a vision of a better society and work towards it.
Jonathan, even before you write your next book, it's understandable that people gravitate to the questions of feasibility. one can accept the majesty of your vision and still go to the practical questions rather quickly. And in that spirit, let me help you write your next book by steering us towards some of the feasibility questions. To begin with, elections are now looming in both Israel and Palestine. Whether there are going to be real changes in government or in the Palestinian Authority, the results are unclear. But I wonder if you could identify potential Palestinian leaders who might pursue your vision.
I think my vision, maybe because we are the weaker party, not because we are more moral than the Israeli Zionists. I think you will find a greater majority of Palestinians who are willing to buy into this vision. The Palestinians who still talk about the two-state solution, the majority of them are because we've been told, don't you dare mention the words one state. It's the equivalent of negating Zionism, and it's it's a conversation stopper. It's dead on arrival. You can't even talk. We were not allowed. It was taboo to speak one state until very recently, I think, because by saying you want one state, it means you reject Israel as a Jewish state. It means you're almost like Hitler. You want to throw us in the sea. You want to negate us. You want to delegitimize us. So we were forced to say, okay, let's go for two states. So for Palestinians, I think it's easier to buy into a vision of one state and equality. But I don't say it as one state, one person, one vote, therefore you negate the other. I was saying one state within certain controls, within certain perimeters, within certain guarantees that take in and accept the view and the needs of the other. If you've read the book, you will see that I go out of my way to address the security fears of the Israelis. And I have two novel ideas for doing that. That maybe most Palestinians haven't thought of it that way. I say, okay, you want equality, you're worried. How about creating a constitutional framework that forever will keep the defense ministry, defense minister, head of the Air Force, Navy, nuclear commission will always be Jewish, with an Arab deputy. But the head of police will always be Arab, with a Jewish deputy. And all other positions in the army will be open on the basis of merit, and those who don't want to serve can just do national service. That's one idea. And the other, which I like even better, is 10% of the defense budget will always go towards the Ministry of Cooperation and Reconciliation, that helps each community to deal with the other community, to understand its history, its language, its culture, and for joint projects to be done. Because the biggest threat to the security of the Jewish Israeli today does not come from Iran, does not come from fundamentalism. It comes from a Palestinian schoolgirl with a pair of scissors in her pocket and who wants to do something against Jews and Zionists. And the way you deal with that is by working deliberately and assertively to create better relations between Jews and Arabs. That's why 10% of the defense budget should go to that ministry for peace and understanding and tolerance. And that's how you arrive at security, not by giving you another squadron of F-38s. That's not how you arrive at security.
Jonathan, I believe fair-minded people will say those are reasonable and constructive ideas that certainly deserve full consideration as this debate unfolds. Before I turn to some other points, though, Rabbi Suskin, there's a parallel question for you to the one I posed for Jonathan. Alana, do you foresee changes in the Israeli government that might either revive a path toward the two-state solution or explore the kind of approach outlined by Mr. Kuttab?
So it's a hard, we've just gotten through our own election here in this country, and we're still sort of in the chaos resulting from the last, I would even say 5 or 6 years, or maybe 50 years, depending on what you think that path came through as. So it's difficult to see exactly what's going to be happening in the Middle East as a result of that election. At this moment, it's not at all clear to me that no matter what the American government does, that there's likely to be significant change to the Israeli government. I could be wrong. I would love to see, well, I mean, in my fantasy world, it would be Ayman Odeh as prime minister. Like that's the, that would be a lovely thing to see. I don't think it's likely, but you never know. In that sense, I would love to see finally for Netanyahu to have his various peccadillos catch up with him. I would love to see him voted out of office. Maybe it could be that, we've actually turned a corner in the world, that, we had this very dangerous moment for the past 5 years, nationalism rising all across the globe. And all of a sudden, the United States at least is trying to get its act together, and that will lead a revival in other places as well, including the Middle East. God willing, we have to be optimists and have hope. I don't think that the actual, I don't think that there's any signs that we can depend on that happening though. And with that being said, it's not clear about what the way forward would be, regardless. There's sort of basically, I would say 3 outcomes that you could have, right? Because we all agree, everybody on every side agrees that the status quo is not tenable. So one outcome is the two-state solution, one outcome is a one-state solution, and one outcome is, people have suggested federation. And all of them have, at this moment, a lot of strikes against them. And in particular, the one-state solution, I just want to focus on because that's what we're talking about, right? There's some different outcomes, right? There's this, there's the right-wing Israeli, the extremist Israeli version of the one-state solution, which is that there's one state and it's Israel, and God only knows what'll happen. In fact, I remember going to Hebron not so many years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, and we were interviewing a member of Knesset from Bayit Yehudi, which is a very right-wing party. And somebody asked them, well, what'll happen if you get what you want? What's going to happen to the Palestinians? And the answer was ridiculous. And they basically shrugged their shoulders and said, well, we'll let a few good Palestinians come in and our grandchildren will figure out what to do with the rest. And everybody looked at each other, even the people who were relatively right of center were like, that's not an answer. What kind of crazy answer is that? That's ridiculous. And yet on the right, among right-wing people on the Israeli side, there is often open discussion of a one-state solution, meaning one state and it's Jewish state and not Palestinian. And we also see the parallel of that on the one state and it's Palestinian and no Jews, right? Those are both things that exist and people talk about them. And each side is busy trying to smoosh down the other one while saying, we can talk about one state over here, but our one state, not your one state. And I think what Mr. Kuttab is offering is a more equitable vision, which would say it's a one state, but it's a one state that has, equality, not necessarily one vote for one person, but generally speaking, a democratic state where minorities are protected. And it's, as I said before, I think it is a lovely vision. The one thing that I worry about is how we would get to that when we actually exist in a moment where talking about one state almost immediately triggers, in most people hearing that, the other 2 kinds of one state solutions, and that's both in support of one's own group and in fear of the other group, whichever that one happens to be, that either we're going to support our own view of one state, the one where we get to rule and the others get to disappear, or it's fear of that group, right? Oh, they're talking about one state. That's what they mean. They mean no Jews, or they mean no Palestinians. So overcoming that is going to be a huge burden. I mean, an enormous burden, because the Jewish community is immediately triggers thoughts of that. You know, like there's Linda Sarsour, who's an American Palestinian, who talks about this. I've had conversations with her about this, and yet, you know, she has advocated for essentially not as thought out a version as Mr. Kuttab, but she's like, I'm fine with a one state solution where everyone gets a vote. You know, there's equality for everybody. And yet her name is almost by itself enough to trigger paranoia in the Jewish community. Like, if she shows up at an event, they're like, see, that proves that's an anti-Semitic event. And this is a real burden. And I don't know how to address it, except for partly what I'm doing with Pomegranate Initiative. But, you know, it's really hard to see how we're going to overcome that.
I think that is a problem that we have to be very forthright in recognizing. These cross pressures have been with us a long time. They continue. Before I turn to a different kind of question for the last question before we go to general interventions from the audience, I would note that one of the real impediments to discussing a one-state solution has been the fear, ever since the world changed in 1967, the fear on the part of many Israelis, demographers and others, that what would happen in time would be a path, an evolution toward majority dominance by Palestinians in any single state solution, holding control of the West Bank. Many people, I think, feared would lead very much in that direction, even if it retained a status of being an occupied territory. So the demographic devil that Mr. Kuttab mentions briefly in his book is one that has caused great alarm for a long time on the part of people finding difficulty in a balanced approach to governing the entire territory with both populations participating in the government. Let me ask a very different question now, and maybe it comes back to you, Jonathan. During the Trump years, Israel has managed to broaden its diplomatic relations with a number of Arab states. Those developments would seem to diminish the longstanding preoccupation of some Arab states with the Palestinian problem, as they describe it. What impact do you think this shift in the diplomatic landscape will have as you try to get attention to the one-state option, or possibly the revival of a two-state ambition?
Well, the deals that Netanyahu and Trump cut between Israel and a number of Arab states have been largely arms deals, basically. They made no pretense even to be addressing the question of Palestinians or Palestinian rights. In fact, they were all done with very highly undemocratic authoritarian regimes that wanted to have some benefit to themselves. The deal with Morocco, I think, was worst of all, because it was done at the expense of international law, Western Sahara rights, and the idea was, let's not worry about the Palestinians. Let's make peace with the Arab world. If the Arab world is willing to forget about Palestinians, there is no reason why we shouldn't have trade relations, diplomatic relations with them, arms deals with them, and forget about the Palestinians and forget about issues of justice or international law. In a sense, that is a step backwards. If you really care about peace and you care about justice, then these deals are normalization with a situation that should not be normal and should not be acceptable. Many Palestinians said, oh, this has nothing to do with us other than further weaken our position, which is already so weak with respect to Israel. We thought maybe that the Arab world will help us. they really haven't helped us in the past. And now at least some of these Arab regimes are openly saying, don't look to us for help. We're not going to help you. In the book, I mentioned that one of the biggest obstacles to peace is a huge disparity of power between Palestinians and Israeli. And these deals further that disparity instead of bring it towards a more equal situation. So it doesn't help us, these deals that Israel has with the Arab world. But it also leads to something much, much deeper. And I think I can speak now for people in the Israeli leftist or Israeli peace camp. They've complained for a long time that the United States is not helping them. It's making their job harder. Because every time they would try to make an argument for peace with the Palestinians, they will say, if we don't make peace with the Palestinians, the Arab world would be upset. The international community will be upset. The United States will be upset. And comes Trump and says, you don't have to worry about international law. You don't have to worry about the Arab world. You don't have to worry about upsetting the United States. Do what you want. We're with you. We support you. So in a sense, they feel that they have been betrayed. Their own argument to their own fellow Israelis has been weakened. Because here, Netanyahu will say, I can do all these things. I can even annex the West Bank. I can have more settlements. And the United States doesn't care. In fact, they're supporting me. They're saying, do what you want. We are behind you. So in a real way, that weakens the left wing in Israel and strengthens the right wing, which says there are no consequences. You can do what you want. There are no consequences. You don't need to make any concessions, painful concessions to the Palestinians. Why should you? You can have your cake and you can eat it too, as long as the United States allows you to do it.
As we turn to questions from others in the audience, may I offer two passing observations prompted by your very important perspective there. One is, I think we've entered a period where we can be confident the United States will not be saying anything goes, and whatever the Israeli preference may be with regard to settlements and related matters will govern. I think that is certainly changing with the new administration. Secondly, a very interesting question that hangs in the air with many complexities running in many directions is whether there are developments yet involving Saudi Arabia as a factor in the Arab world that will bear on the Israeli-Palestinian question. I don't think we need to discuss that right now, but I think it is apparent to observers in the region that there are still issues hanging out there that bear on Saudi behavior that we don't know the outcome on just yet. Tim, I'm going to turn to you now to steer us toward questions from the chat room or flag us interveners by the wave of their hand.
Sure, yeah, so anyone who wants to pop a question in the chat, that is great. You can raise your virtual hand by clicking on that button, or you can just wave your hand. A couple of comments that were in the chat that probably aren't the answerable questions, but Kaylee McAvoy asked a very large scale question about decreasing militarization budgets across the world. We will not ask Jonathan or Elena to solve that problem, but we will hold that up as a vision for sure. A specific question for Elena that I think she may have answered earlier, given his vision may be unrealistic, as you said, what do you see as a way forward? But I think you may have answered that already with outlining some other things. But anything you want to touch on, Rabbi Suskin, as possible? What are other concrete steps, perhaps?
Concrete steps are going to be very hard to come by. I guess what I would say, first of all, I just wanted to jump in briefly to the previous question, which is yes, I agree with Mr. Kuttab that interactions with other governments in the Middle East have somewhat weakened the left. But I do also want to note that a lot of those were not new. Many of those there were already years and years of back channel discussions going on. They basically were just sort of reifying agreements that essentially already existed. So I'm not actually sure how much of a change it is, except for the fact that it sort of undermines any anti-normalization kinds of things. So who knows, maybe it won't make a huge amount of difference in going forward. And I think with the new administration, maybe there is a potential. I noticed the panicked, I think we all did, the panicked, comments from various ambassadors from Israel saying like, why hasn't Biden called yet? Like it was like, the dismissed girlfriend or something. So, who knows? It could be that we'll see some changes in that way. And so in terms of, moving forward, I'm not sure there is a way forward, honestly. I mean, if there's, there's the status quo is untenable. I'm hoping that, in terms of two states, maybe it's not dead, maybe it's comatose and the new administration will be able to revive it. I just, each of the possible ways forward has incredible burdens at the moment. And, this isn't just sort of what's my personal opinion. Like I've had these conversations with a lot of people who are in the same space as I am in terms of work, long-term work on this issue, very knowledgeable about it, who have said they also don't see a way forward. And I think maybe that will leave you a space, Mr. Kuttab, for something which is really out of the box like this. I do think just the very perspective, there's sort of almost an instinctive sort of push for Jews to say like one state is just not an option. Why are we the only folks who can't have a Jewish state? As you noted in your book, right, that was, that's something that is going to have to be overcome. And I think it will be very difficult. Even Jews who are, I would say left of center in general, have sort of a very strong response to the idea of one state. So what is the way forward? I don't know. That's why I can say that even though I'm generally sort of a two-state solution person, I actually have a lot of respect and admiration for this book that you put forth and this idea. Maybe it'll work. It's certainly a lovely idea.
Well, it certainly is not likely to work without following John Kennedy's principle that on earth, God's work must surely be our own. It's going to take a lot of labor to advance it. I don't want to sidetrack our discussion to an American political conversation, but I do want to note that my reference to what I expect to be a less accommodating posture by the new Biden administration vis-a-vis the current Israeli government is one that Mark Braverman expresses doubts about. He points out that the US administrations habitually have found themselves in Israel's corner on many of the key issues. We don't need to discuss that, but I think his point needs to be registered. Tim, you have other questions you identified?
Well, yeah, so you mentioned God's work, issues of peace and justice in Palestine and Israel are political issues, and they are certainly religious issues as well. So a question from Jerry Foltz in the chat. Both Jewish and Muslim theology support wonderful views of peace and human rights. Can religious leaders be drawn into the leadership of this? Is it possible to have a civil rights / passive resistance movement that appeals to the religious understanding? Is it possible to expand non-political attitude change?
Jonathan, can we ask you to take that up?
Yes, I think that religion can be and should be a very positive element for moving forward. But for that to happen, religion has to take a strong prophetic position. And by that, I mean issues of justice and equality and human rights must be very central and must be undertaken without trying to be realistic at the same time, without trying to play politics. In other words, I need to hear Jewish voices, Muslim, Jewish, or Christian, that say, look, from our religious perspective, you have to have equality. This is unfair, this is unjust, this is against God's will. Without at the same time saying, however, political considerations require us to be realistic, and therefore we're not going to demand equality because that somehow is not realistic right now. Religious people have to say, God, thus saith the Lord. God says this is wrong, and I want you to stop it, regardless of whether it's politically agreeable or not agreeable at this point. Unfortunately, the kind of religious voices we've been hearing, and if you'll allow me to speak about evangelical Christians who speak in the name of the Bible, in the name of religion, but who have no concept of justice and no concept of equality, and who just want Israel because it's God's people. They are the chosen people. They're allowed. God gave them this land, and they're allowed to do whatever they want, because this speeds up the second coming, and this speeds up our eschatological views about the end times, and therefore they should be allowed to do whatever they want to do. I'm not talking about this type of religious view. I'm talking about a religious view that speaks for justice and that is willing to confront power with truth, and that is willing to challenge the concept of chosen people. What does chosen people mean? Does it mean privileged people? Does it give them special status in God's eye? Does God love them more than he loves Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians? What does this concept of Am Sgula, what does it mean? A chosen people. And what does promised land mean? Is God territorial? Is God tribal? This type of discussion at Bethlehem Bible College, we tried to do a series of conferences called Christ at the Checkpoint, where we tried to engage theologians into how does their theology influence real life situations today. So yes, you can have religious people engage in a political discussion and challenging power by everybody. Yes, we can have religious people be involved, but again, the issues should be justice, should be the nature of God, should be, and you'd be surprised. It can be tremendously powerful political tool, but it can't be if they're trying to play politics, if they're trying to be realistic, if they're trying to be acceptable in the halls of power, if they're trying to be, this is how I see engaging the religious people in a positive way for peace and for justice.
Well, Jonathan, probably everyone on this discussion today knows that meeting in a congregational arena, as we are, a congregational church arena, congregationalists in their sterner moments have been known as God's frozen people. I want to turn to Alana for a related issue, though. Alana, can you identify with some confidence rabbinical voices in Israel who can be sympathetic to the kind of perspective that Jonathan has put forward and who have some standing to advance it?
So first of all, I just want to start by responding to Reverend Tut. I actually reject the idea that this is a religious conflict. This is not a religious conflict. It's purely a political conflict, although the politics have corrupted the religious, some parts of the religious arena, I would say, in the sense that, this is not something which is going to be solved with religion. I mean, insofar as Mr. Kuttab notes, yes, religious leaders have a responsibility to always say, God views all humans, B'Tselem Elohim, as created in the image of God. All humans, right? There's no, right? The Jewish tradition has a lot of commentaries on the creation of the Adam, the earth creature, the first person. And one of them actually says, right, that the reason God created one and not many is so that no person can say my father had a better lineage than yours, right? All people have the same lineage, and it was all our father is the Adam, the non-sexed creature that came out of the earth, and the earth was taken from the four corners, right? It's not red or black or white or yellow. It's all of them mashed together. So in that sense, I think, it's really important to distinguish what the role of religion can play. There have been religious leaders in Israel for quite some time who have been on the forefront of this in various different ways, right? Some of them in not so positive ways, but what the organization Shomrei Mishpat has existed for decades now. There was an American branch called Rabbis for Human Rights, which eventually became the organization Trua. I've been on their board for a very long time. I haven't been on the board in the last few years, but have been working on, they were, created specifically to work on this issue, that there should be a homeland for Palestinians as well as for Jews, and have been doing that work. Arik Asherman, who was one of the founders of Shomrei Mishpat, eventually went off and found his own organization. He's still doing that work. There's even, a few, vanishingly few, but they do exist among the settlers. Or, for example, the organization Shorashim, which has a settler rabbi who, I'm really bad with names. I actually met him several years ago and had a whole conversation with him when he was just a settler and didn't know his Palestinian neighbors. He went out and he met one, and they now work together and they travel around the US. They often speak in churches. They're worth hearing. They're actually behind the sort of federation idea. That's one of their things. So there are a few, right, who are not, as Mr. Kuttab said, like not necessarily involving themselves in specific politics about it, but are really, really focused on the equality of humanity and the necessity for change. And I think those are the organizations, both here and in Israel, who are, at least in a religious way, taking the lead. But I think it's also important not to cut out the political work that needs to be done as well. And I think that that's really where it should be. It shouldn't be in focusing on religion. The other, I did want to mention one thing about evangelicals, which is evangelicals don't support Israel because of the chosen people. That's not their interest. Evangelicals support Israel because of the possibility of the bringing forward the return of the Messiah, is my understanding from talking to that. So that's not, from the sort of right-wing Jewish perspective, they're just, why do we care? They're wrong, obviously. And if they want to give us money, they give us money, right? So that's also like how politics can really corrupt at both ends of the spectrum. And I do think that all of these are really important conversations to have, right? Both in terms of where to make that distinction of who to support in order to move the needle forward, right? Whatever good outcome, whether it's two-state or a one-state solution like Mr. Kuttab's, it's really going to come about through politics. It's not going to come about through religion.
I would synthesize the observations you're making, Alana, by saying politics has to be the instrument for this process of change. But perhaps we can at least hope, expect, perhaps demand that the voices of religion radiating through society stand firmly and clearly and regularly for justice for all human beings.
Oh, I agree.
That posture of the emphasis on justice is certainly an appropriate emphasis from within the religious communities to be expressed toward the political community. They are overlapping in many ways.
Well, look, I agree that there is an obligation for people of faith to actually take stands on moral issues, and this is a moral issue. But it is also a political issue, and the political piece is the piece that needs to change. That's where the change comes through. but partly it's about changing people's hearts, right? And helping to alleviate fear so that people can move across it. And I'm not sure you can actually achieve those ends in the same space. I think they both need to be achieved, but they need to be achieved on parallel tracks. That's actually why I'm not actually working at a different organization now. Like, I'm working at Pomegranate Initiative because I really feel that fighting anti-Semitism and Islamophobia by going to evangelical churches and talking about why evangelicals don't need to be afraid of Muslims, right? That we're all fellow citizens here, is actually one of the ways to change hearts in the US, and that will have a long-term effect. I don't think it's going to change things in, say, the next 3 years, but I'm hoping that in the next 20 it will, or maybe the next 50.
Well, that is a mission worth a decade or a half century or a century's investment of good effort. Tim, before we turn toward the conclusions, are there one or two final questions you want to?
So I see Maren Goodson's hand, and I think Donald Bickford may have had, no, you were just moving. Okay, sorry. Okay, Maren may have a comment, and then there's a couple from the chat that may be good concluding.
Right. We had received a nice email from our friend Jeff Wright with 3 questions. I'd like to certainly have those addressed if we can. Jeff, is it okay if I read the first one? Okay. He wrote, a dominant group must feel, he's quoting you, Jonathan, a dominant group must feel internal or external pressure, whether military, economic, or otherwise, before it adjusts its behavior. Ultimately, both sides must be coerced or convinced. So this Jonathan has a question, Jonathan Wright. Will it take some significant form of pressure even before a consequential conversation can begin, both in Palestine and in Israel? And if so, what would be the most effective pressure, and where are the most likely sources of this pressure to move Palestinians or to move Israelis? In other words, what will it take for this conversation to be broadly undertaken among both peoples with some expectation of its success? So what kind of pressure applied where?
Jonathan, I think that is a question directly to you.
Okay.
And then also to the rabbi.
I think one of the most important places of pressure is the United States, because the United States right now is part of the problem. They are preventing concrete actions in Israel by providing military, economic, and most importantly, political support. And they're providing an umbrella to prevent real progress from taking place along the lines of human rights, international law, and frankly, sanctions against some of the most outrageous things that Israel does. Now, how do you bring about that pressure? Well, one way is to say that we expect in the United States that in return for all this assistance that we're giving you, we expect you to act as a democratic country. We expect that you do not use tactics, methods, and apartheid. In a way, the two-state solution has become the excuse. We're not apartheid. You know, there's a Palestinian Authority, some there, and they're responsible for vaccines for the Palestinians, for example. And Israel is presented as the world gold standard for providing vaccines to its people. Well, what about the Palestinians? Well, they're the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority or somebody else. I think the United States should say, wait a minute, you know, vaccines, you know, this virus doesn't distinguish between Arab and Jew. And you have to give it to everybody. You're even giving it to undocumented workers. But you're not giving it to the Palestinian workers, and you're not giving it to the Palestinian people. So this is an example of a place where the United States can say, no, we do not hold you as the only democracy in the Middle East if you don't provide some democracy, some equality, some justice, to Palestinians. So
Donna,
here's
could I get you into this discussion of the point? Do you think there are potentially effective pressure points that bear on America's relationship with the Israeli government, or do you see it as a hopeless or counterproductive effort?
no, I think there are many points of effective pressure to be used in this country. Now, if the government is not willing to use those points of pressure, that's where churches and civil society starts getting involved. That's where the new demon called BDS comes in. Boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. If the government doesn't do it, ordinary people start doing it and start asking people to do it. Now, and I think Israel realizes that. That is why they are demonizing BDS, even though it's a movement that at its very core is against discrimination, is against violence. It's a nonviolent movement, yet it's being demonized, and they're even passing laws against BDS because they realize that that's where pressure comes from. If the US government doesn't do it, then civil society and ordinary people start doing it. And that's why BDS becomes very important. And that's why I think Israel and its supporters in this country are so fanatically opposed to BDS. I remember a Canadian friend of mine used to say, 5 years ago, he said that, and it's much more true today. He says he tells his Israeli friends and their supporters, guys, you won. There's not going to be a Palestinian state. Now what? What are you going to do now? There's not going to be a Palestinian state. You've created so many facts on the ground. You've succeeded in beating down, atomizing, fragmenting the Palestinians, controlling them so effectively, there'll never be a Palestinian state. What are you going to do now? And they go silent because the only answer is apartheid.
And that's
We have all the power, and we won't give it to the Palestinian Arabs. And when you're dealing with a situation of apartheid, which is the reality, what do you do? What do you do?
Alana, may I ask you to hold off for just a moment? I wanted you to intervene, but would you bundle your next comment with responses to Tim summarizing the couple of additional queries that you wanted to flag for us, Tim? Just would you bundle the last two or so? You're gonna
Leave
pass?
me out of this. Leave me out of this. Let's hear from the two of them. Thank you.
Okay, Alana, we're nearing the end of our discussion, so let me ask you to pick up on the line of conversation that we were exploring with Jonathan a moment ago.
Sure. I actually have to say that I largely agree. I don't have an enormous amount of disagreement with what he said. I would love to see, for example, our government, the United States government, reinstate the policy that distinguishes between settlement products and non-settlement products. Like, that's a really tiny thing to do, and it was non-controversial for decades. Both parties did it, completely bipartisan. It should just be a thing that, you know, is perfectly normal because one is in Israel and one is out of Israel. In terms of, you know, I would like to see money being aid being connected to good behavior, you know, like the willingness to sit down at the table and negotiate, whether that's negotiating borders or whatever the next step happens to be. These are all fairly small things to do that I think are very commonsensical. And in terms of BDS, so BDS is complicated. I knew it would come up eventually. I'm surprised it waited till the end. So here's what I'd say about this. It has indeed been turned into a boogeyman. Enough of a boogeyman that, in fact, there are 40 states that currently have some kind of anti-BDS legislation in effect right now. which is problematic both internally in terms of our own constitution. And I know I've heard all the arguments from people saying, no, they were carefully crafted. They're not, they're not really a violation of free speech, blah, blah, blah. I disagree. I think they should all be removed. And I would say just about BDS, so two things. One is, it is definitely true that some people use BDS to hide anti-Semitic ideas. It is also true that some people use anti-Semitism to hide opposition to any kind of protest. Like, those are both
Right.
true at the same time. And I think it's really, it just always struck me as bizarre that for decades, Israel and American Jews have said, like, we really want Palestinians to use nonviolent protest methods. See, if they just did that, everything would be different. Okay, so BDS is a nonviolent protest method. And, to respond to that by saying, okay, but they can't use that now. Like, it's almost, it's the same playbook that says, don't take a knee, right? It's the same, like, you redefine whatever protest there is to make it out of bounds. Okay, so if there's anti-Semitism in BDS, all right, let's weed it out. And, but that doesn't mean that any protest method now gets to be labeled as out of bounds. And I do think, like, at APN, one of the things that, was long before, it had been talked about generally, sort of like the Zionist BDS, which is, we say we boycott anything from outside the green line. Okay, great. That's a good start. And, that has become, like very much, like, oh, that's anti-Semitic. It's very problematic to use that. And I think that the extreme right, has deliberately tried to confuse the issue about what is anti-Semitism and not anti-Semitism, in the same way that, there's an attempt to confuse the issue about, like, between being Jewish and being Israeli, right? Like, of course, all Jews across the world have a deep connection to Israel. Like, that is absolutely unquestionably part of our liturgy, part of our religion, part of the Hebrew scriptures. We definitely see Israel as our homeland. That doesn't necessarily mean all Jews are Israelis any more than all Israelis are Jews. And I think that it's, it's, everyone is going to have to learn to walk that fine line, because I think it's important as part of our, I guess, to go back to our religious issue, right? Which is this a religious issue? How does religion get involved? Right? Religion gets involved in the moral stance. There are moral stances, right? Which is, don't be an anti-Semite, just like don't be an Islamophobe, and don't, those are all bad things. And our religious leaders and our political leaders too have to be involved and say, there are moral lines. And at the same time, also recognize that BDS is nonviolent. It's a tactic like any other tactic. It was used in South Africa. It was used in Ireland. There's all kinds of places where this tactic was used, and it's a totally legitimate tactic. So I guess that's my 2 cents. How's that?
Well, we come now to the most important and challenging moment. Can we wrap this up in a graceful way, even though there are still dozens of comments and messages in the chat room? Mr. Kuttab, you have about a minute of a final observation you would like to make?
Yes. I'm tempted to say that sometimes talking about the broader questions becomes an alibi to avoid concrete actions. Talking about 2-state, 1-state, etc., avoids dealing with the reality of everyday problems. And everyday problems need to be addressed, and need to be addressed forthrightly and prophetically, and with a sense of justice, human rights, and dignity. We need to lift the siege of Gaza. It's just, that's a no-brainer. It needs to be done immediately. You can't leave 2 million people under constant siege. We need to stop sending children to military courts, period. There's been half a century of that. We need to stop collective punishments. Stop administrative detention, putting people in jail with no charges, no trial. We need to stop destroying houses. We need to allow Palestinians to, at least in the West Bank, to build in Area C. These are just no-brainers. These are issues that we need to be working on continuously. And we need to stop using the excuse of two states, Palestinian Authority, to let Israel off the hook for clearly apartheid, racist, discriminatory policies.
That's a stern and very powerful commentary, Jonathan. Alana, do you want a final moment for a last point?
Sure. I mean, I would agree that there's all kinds of intermediate steps that we need to be taking, that not knowing what the outcome will be is not an excuse for not acting now. And, you know, I think, I don't know what the eventual solution is at the moment. I think, you know, two-state solution, maybe, I don't know, who knows if it's can be revived. One-state solution, you know, has some insurmountable or seemingly insurmountable things as well. But in the meantime, there is plenty to do. And that none of us should be waiting to do them. You know, if the smallest steps can make a difference, even just saying like, let's reinstate settlement labeling, you know, settlement product labeling. Great, that's one step that we can do. Or, you know, protesting, as you say, administrative detentions and house demolitions. These are all things which we have been fighting for a long time, and there is no reason to stop fighting them now. We need to continue to fight them. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to really connect with organizations that are doing that work already, particularly organizations within Israel that are doing them, because that, you know, well, to a certain extent, prevents people from saying, no, it's just anti-Semitism. I mean, if we talk with organizations like Shomrei Mishpat and Trua here in the US, organizations that do that work, Committee Against Housing Demolition, that is a way to move forward and to at least take those intermediate steps. And who knows, maybe that will be an opportunity for us to take more steps if we're able to accomplish those things as well.
Thank you very much, Alana and Jonathan. In closing, I want to apologize to the many people whose contributions to the chat room we have not been able to answer or respond to. And I would offer a short reflection, perhaps naive, perhaps slightly optimistic. An American ambassador once suggested that Arabs and Jews should get together and start acting like good Christians. Apart from the long history of internecine warfare among Christians, that sardonic notion offers little encouragement in light of the current disruptions in American civic life, many of them marked by religious zeal. What can be said at this juncture is more clinical. In the area of Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, roughly 13 million human beings now live, about half of them Israeli, half of them Palestinian. However, those numbers may evolve over time. However, those numbers change. Those two communities will coexist indefinitely into a future they must define. Former Secretary of State James Baker once said, perhaps with quite a bit of exasperation, that Americans cannot care more about this problem than the parties involved. But Americans do care a lot about the peoples of the Holy Land, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and others. While bystanders cannot resolve the disputes between Israelis and Palestinians, they must at least do nothing to compound or perpetuate those disputes. From that standpoint, the task for the United States is modest but clear. Recover the stance of good faith interlocutor between Israelis and Palestinians. That stance requires empathy for all those caught up in the conflict. If there's a hint of hope on that point, one may find it in the personal dedication over a long career and the fair-minded sympathies of a new American president. May it be so. Reverend Tutt, back to you for closing.
Well, I concluded my Buddhist prayer earlier by saying, let all God's people say amen. And so to Alton Frye's very fine sermon there, I would invite that same response, let all God's people say amen. Thank you, Alana. Thank you, Jonathan, for your thoughts, for your time, for your energy, for your wisdom, for your passion, your honesty. Thank you so much. And Alton, thank you for guiding us through this conversation. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to pop up the screen with Jonathan's book and our church website. So if you want to get a copy of his book, you can see it. If you have questions about our Middle East Committee, you can track us down through that website. And I will yield the floor to Maren Goodson for some final words. There you go. You're muted still, Maren.
Do this the whole fashion.
There you go.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Tim, and thank you for your contributions to this and the support that the Middle East Committee always has at Westmoreland. I also want to point out that the committee started back in the 70s, and either the first or one of the earliest chairpersons of the committee was Alton Frye. So he's been at this a long time with us. I also want to thank the audience for your thoughtful questions and careful attention. And I ask one more thing of you. If you could write into the chat box how you learned about this event. I worked really hard to try to get the word out to as many people as possible, but you never know what works. And this is a chance to do that. So if you could just put it in there before we leave. And some of you who have attended our live meetings know that we usually give everybody, our guest speakers, a bottle of Palestinian olive oil from our olive oil ministry closet. Well, we can't do that. So in light of that, we are going to send, on behalf of the committee, a small donation to Nonviolence International in honor of Jonathan's efforts, and we'll ask them to direct that to support of spreading the word about the book, and to Alana's group, Pomegranate Initiative. So that in lieu of olive oil, perhaps that will help a little bit. We don't have a definite program for March yet, but based on something that Alana said, I think I'm going to see if Peter Macari from Global Missions will describe Global Missions work with Palestinian and Israeli partners. That includes B'Tselem and other groups, so we can see what we're doing, what Global Ministries is doing, and what we as disciples and Christian Church, what we as UCC and Christian Church Disciples of Christ are doing in the area ourselves. We'll see if that works out. We do have a definite program for April 18th. I'm going to read to you the name of the book because I sometimes get it wrong. Gary Wasserman, who is author of The Doha Experiment, Arab Kingdom, Catholic College, Jewish Teacher, will be talking to us. He's a friend of two members of our congregation, and he says about his book, in the beginning, this sounds like a politically incorrect joke. A Jewish guy walks into a fundamentalist Arab country to teach American politics at a Catholic college. That will be on April 18th after our worship service. If you would like to join our mailing list so you'll get these details, just put your name, just send me an email, mpgoodson@comcast.net. That was in the promotional materials. And that concludes today's program. But if you'd like to stay online for just an unstructured chat, feel free. Let's say we'll shut down at 5 o'clock. If you can, is that okay with you, Tim? And
you can stay as long as you want to. I'll be going to another meeting in just a moment, but you're all welcome to spend the night here together.
And speakers can stay if you want, and we'll stay until the conversation dies down or until